Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast, episode 72. My name is Matt Wood, and today we'll be talking about the life of Kanaye Nagasawa, the Japanese wine baron of Fountaingrove. There's more than the usual backstory today, but I think it's all important. At least half a dozen other characters in our story have lives that folks spend their own lives studying. Those around Sonoma might know the beats of the story. If you aren't familiar with it, we'll be in Edo-era Japan, but also Scotland, New York, and California for a story involving war, shipwrecks, smuggled students, and California's first utopian colony winery. A special thanks to Gayla Barron, whose knowledge, writing, and studying of Fountaingrove is unsurpassed, and Ig Akaboshi of Freeman Winery, a great-great-grandnephew of Nagasawa, who was able to provide me with invaluable info and lots of pronunciation help. I hope I get them all correct. A quick reminder that there's a Patreon at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast. The link is in the show notes also. Any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. Telling a friend is a great way to help out too. Okay, Kanaye Nagasawa, here we go.
In 1865, a young samurai student, Kanaye Nagasawa, left Japan to learn what made the West economically strong and technologically advanced. 10 years later, he founded a small winery at Santa Rosa, California, called the Fountaingrove Round Barn and Winery. Soon he became known as the Grape King of California. Nagasawa came to California to learn and stayed to enrich our lives. Both our countries owe much to this Japanese warrior turned businessman.
That's President Ronald Reagan praising Kanaye Nagasawa in 1983 on a trip to Japan. The only subject or potential subject of our podcast to receive an honor like this. To understand how this came to be, we need to hop back a few centuries. The story is wild, so I think it's worth it. Our story starts back in the early 1600s of Japan. Contact with the outside world was mostly forbidden by the Tokugawa shogunate. After the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 helped put an end to warring feudal groups, Tokugawa Ieyasu assumed control of the country. While in power, he reorganized the daimyo, or feudal lords, their land holdings, and their influence. Those who fought on his side were rewarded, while those who had fought against him were punished. Some, like the Satsuma and its ruling Shimatsu family, were almost ignored. They had fought on the wrong side of the battle, but because of their advantageous and remote position in the far southern portion of the archipelago, they were able to retain a degree of autonomy. Southern Kyushu and Ryukyu, what we now know as Okinawa, were the base of their power. This was the beginning of the Edo period, marking over 250 years of thriving economy, creation, and enjoyment of the arts, stability, and isolationism. The Shimazu, though, had developed a heavy reliance on international trade over the years. With their wealth, connections, and proximity to water and China, they were one of the only clans with access to the wider world. Through their trading, they would receive copies of European writings, usually in Dutch, as well as Chinese works. European ships continued to ply the surrounding waters more and more for trading and whaling. Although this trade was illegal for the Satsuma, as we mentioned earlier, they were mostly left to their own devices and continued expanding trade, as well as their knowledge of the world outside of the Japanese borders. By 1850, the idea of the Shimazu sending some select students to the European continent for continuing education was catching on. This would all be done secretly, of course. The project never quite got off the ground until in 1862, a cultural misunderstanding with British tourists and high-ranking Satsuma members eventually ended up with British warships stationed in the bay. After years of the project being shelved, by 1864, the time had come to implement it. The School of Western Studies, or Kaiseijo, was founded with a small group of students, among them Isanaga Hikosuke, a precocious child of 12 years old from Kagoshima. He was born into a path of becoming a samurai, and the Bushido, or way of the warrior, was ingrained in him since youth. striving for wisdom, courage, benevolence, and politeness, among other characteristics. His scholarly-minded parents educated him on both the teachings of Confucius, whose works the boy memorized, as well as translations of English language works they were able to obtain. Education of the students at the school evolved to include shipbuilding, astronomy, chemistry, math, and of course English. Astronomy and calendar making had run in Isunaga's family for generations, and these skills had been instilled in him very early on. Despite his young age, through hard work and intelligence, he achieved Daisanto Shosei, or the third-ranked student at school. Isunaga Hikosuke was the youngest of the Kagoshima 15, as the students that were preparing to travel were known. The oldest was 28, and there were 4 adult inspectors, sort of chaperones who were set to travel along with them. Many of the students had a specialized area of study they would concentrate on. For some, that was the English language or mathematics. For others, it was machinery or medicine, naval or army tactics, shipbuilding or surveying. Of course, nothing happens in isolation, so I'll introduce Nakahama Minjiro, one of the most respected teachers of the children. His life was a legendary one also. His help was invaluable, and this seems like one of those true butterfly effect moments. As a 14-year-old, while working as a bonito fisherman to help support his widowed mother, the boat he was working on became shipwrecked in a storm. After 6 months of struggling to survive on the isolated Torishima Island, the fisherman's rescue came in the form of Captain William Whitfield and his whaling ship, the John Howland. His men had come upon the group while resupplying water for their voyage. The 5 stranded men joined the ship, where they were fed and clothed. Unable to return them to Japan because of the isolationist policies, the ship continued in the whaling grounds until Captain Whitfield made the decision to drop the men off in Honolulu or Oahu. Accounts vary. All of them, that is, except Minjiro. The world had already opened up to him wide as he saw various people and ways of life during stops on the whaling voyage. It's unclear exactly if Whitfield wanted to have the boy educated or if he asked to stay on board. Either way, he was soon on his way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he became most likely the first Japanese resident to live in the U.S. Whitfield's neighbor helped to ensure Minjiro would receive a quality and well-rounded New England education, not just in English, but math, navigation, surveying, and coopering. From helping out the family farm, he even learned to ride horses, which was reserved for only government officials and the samurai class in Japan at the time. His practical education continued as he signed on to the whale ship Franklin. Sailing once again to the Hawaiian Islands, he was briefly reunited with his former shipmates and even chanced upon some other Japanese fishermen. But his homesickness continued to grow, and shortly after returning to New Bedford, he sailed on a ship heading to San Francisco and its newly thriving gold fields. He missed becoming a 49er by just a couple months. With money saved up from whaling and $700 he was able to earn while working in Sacramento, he booked passage on a steamship heading to Hawaii. Once there and reunited again with his shipmates, his plan was put into action. 2 of the other men would join him. With the help of friends made in Hawaii, the group purchased a small boat and named it Adventurer. It would be loaded onto the whaling vessel Sarah Boyd, and after the 3-week sail to the outskirts of the Ryukyu Islands, the ship was lowered into the water and the 3 men braved the breaking waves back to their homeland. It wasn't just the ocean and waves that were dangerous. They knew they would be caught, and possibly punished, imprisoned, or even executed. Once landed, they were interrogated and debriefed by increasingly higher-ranked officials. Commodore Perry had recently left the islands, promising to return to open Japan up to the wider world. This was most likely Minjiro's salvation. With his grasp of Western culture, Minjiro was appointed as a samurai for the shogunate. This rare experience allowed him to take a second name, Nakahama, after his hometown. With his command of the language, he helped negotiate the Kanagawa Treaty, even with the United States' use of gunboat diplomacy. Aside from his teachings, he would translate the landmark Bodich's The New American Practical Navigator into Japanese, as well as authoring books and helping the Japanese Navy in construction of their first warship. With the education supplied to the young Isanaga Hikosuke and his fellow students, it was time to sneak them out of the country to learn firsthand about the Western world. The written order showed that the 19 would inspect Koshikishima and Oshima. Nagasaki was the only international port in Japan at the time. Operating from this port was Scottish trader Thomas Glover. Working primarily with a British trading house, he would export tea, but also import, export, and distribute ships, weapons, coal, and more. With time, Glover would be honored for his contributions and helping to topple the shogunate. However, at this time, treaties and violations weren't his primary concern. Later in life, he would help found the predecessors to both Mitsubishi and Kirin Brewing and be awarded the Order of the Rising Sun. But today, in our story set on April 17, 1865, he was smuggling Isanaga Hikosuke and his fellow students out of Japan. Well, he wasn't Isanaga Hikosuke anymore. To avoid shame and legal repercussions, he was now Kanaye Nagasawa, an alias he would use the rest of his life. Other students had backed out of the trip, but his dad told him, quote, "You can't spend your life hiding like a frog in a well," unquote. Kanaye's mother cried, even though it was frowned upon for mothers of the samurai class. And then he was off. Life changed quickly for the students. Swords were taken away. The food was unfamiliar. Customs were new and different. They cut their hair and adopted Western clothing. Some wrote waka, Japanese poems where they expressed their feelings about leaving their old life behind. But after having been hiding out for 2 months in Hashima waiting to depart, they were now on their adventure. After a brief stay in British-controlled Hong Kong and a quick stop in Singapore, they were on their way to England. By the middle of 1865, they were in England. Most were enrolled at University College London. Nagasawa, being the youngest and still only 13, was too young to enter university and instead ended up a guest of the Glover household in rapidly growing Aberdeen, Scotland. Comforts were sparse at his new Chanonry House school. Oats and porridge to eat, with the occasional fish or meat, and a rare bath. Christianity was the official religion, and attendance at services and prayer meetings was mandatory. Graded note-taking was, too. Nagasawa excelled at school, finishing at or near the top of his classes, which included further English instruction, astronomy, geography, geology, and language instruction in Latin, Greek, German, and French. Back in Japan, things were changing fast. The Boshin War, or Japanese Civil War, was on the horizon. The 15 students and the inspectors had been abroad for less than a year and a half, and now they had perhaps the largest decision of their lives bearing down on them. The Satsuma domain was unable to provide the financial support needed, and students were required to decide if they wanted to return to their homeland and fight, or stay abroad and study on their own. 10 went back, 9 stayed, among them Nagasawa. It was at this point Nagasawa's life took another hard turn. Thomas Glover had stayed in contact with the Satsuma students, especially Nagasawa, who continued to reside at the family home. Through Glover, the students were introduced to Lawrence Oliphant, a diplomat, aristocrat, and author. Oliphant had spent some time in Japan as a member of the first British delegations to the country and as part of a diplomatic team based in Edo. Some injuries sustained in a nighttime attack by Ronin severely injured his hand, forcing his return to England. He actually got off better than his predecessor, who had been murdered. Oliphant had been born in South Africa and served for the crown in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, and had studied in Russia. He professed his love for Japan to the young students, offering to help in their education, sometimes in a teaching capacity or other times financially. The family was a well-off one, and Oliphant was expected to do his part in service of the empire. To all these younger men far away from home in a strange land, he would dole out fatherly advice. A portion of his advice was to seek the teachings of Thomas Lake Harris, whose Brotherhood of the New Life was actively seeking Japanese members. Oliphant was desperate to join Harris, as were his wife and his mother, Lady Oliphant. They were denied joining by Harris until Oliphant's parliamentary duties were wrapped up or resigned, and he became spiritually advanced enough for Harris. The money that Oliphant's family had would help in that process. Nagasawa wasn't the only student to be recruited by Oliphant. Two others went to visit Harris in New York with Oliphant in 1866. The next year, Harris himself visited Europe, where Nagasawa and another 3 students were introduced to him by Oliphant. Nagasawa must have been looking forward to it. The 2 students who had visited Harris at Brockton, New York, reportedly said they, quote, physically felt God's presence inside them, unquote. Oliphant was finally allowed to join too. Thomas Lake Harris was born in England in 1823, but his parents soon moved their family to Utica, New York, raising him in a strict Calvinist Baptist household. Western New York was a hotbed of mystics in the 1800s. From the age of 9, Harris was forced to support his family due to his mother's untimely death. By 21, he was minister of a Universalist church in New York City. And a couple years later, we see him with an independent Christian congregation, where his admirers included Horace Greeley, the young publisher of the New York Tribune. Arthur Conan Doyle and Walt Whitman were others who would study his writings. The Mountain Cove community of spiritualists in Virginia, where he and his co-founders followed the spiritualist teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, would be Harris's first utopian colony. Unfortunately, it fell apart after only 2 years. They'd claimed the Garden of Eden was located at their homestead in rural Virginia. In the words of one writer, quote, those who had fled to the mountains now fled to their former homes, unquote. Harris regrouped by heading back to England, publishing his writings in books and poems and building the congregation at his London church. He was refining his beliefs during this time, incorporating spiritualism and his divine respiration, a process of meditation and deep breathing that would allow him and his followers to communicate with God through fairies or fays. Harris would be the father and pivot and primate and king of the Brotherhood of the New Life. He preferred to refer to it as theosocialism rather than a religion. Upon returning to the U.S., he started his short-lived Armenia colony, but soon, in search of more space for recent arrivals, founded the Salem-on-Erie colony at Brockton, New York in 1867. In addition to the Japanese students and the Oliphants, there were another 50-some adults, including wealthy women, followers of his, ministers, and also numerous children. Among the other followers was Dr. John Hyde, an experienced viticulturist and winemaker from Missouri. The plot of land they purchased was known as the Diamond and was over 2,000 acres with a mile-plus of shoreline and a railroad junction of the Lakeshore and Allegheny Railroads. It was actually many smaller farms that Harris was able to string together purchases of to create the colony grounds. This is where the village would be. It cost a lot of money for 2,000 acres of land, and Harris chipped in some. The rest came from his followers, many of whom were pretty well off. Lady Oliphant was said to have used her jewels for a chunk of the payment. Businesses and parks were planned. Harris had ideas for the natural gas spring that came up near his Vine Cliff house, too. Maybe a power source or for heating. He also had the most impressive waterfall of the area nearby. Harris's use, as the community was known, was finally complete. Agriculture would be the main source of income for the colony. They would operate the well-regarded Chautauqua County greenhouses and nursery and grow hay, processing around 1,200 tons a year. Grape growing and winemaking would be done under the Lake Erie and Missouri River Wine Company name. On a scouting visit, a colony representative met with Garrett Reichman, who ran his own well-regarded Brockton winery. Reichman's grandfather, the Deacon Elijah Fay, was the pioneer grape grower around here, and Reichman promoted the area strongly to the potential newcomers, His winery would later go on to be the base of the first Welch's plant. This was actually the colony's second attempt at viticulture following a brief stint at Armenia, but we don't have any further records of that first try. In addition to Hyde, there was Rensselaer Moore, who had experienced propagating vines in the Hudson Valley. It was decided they would base the viticulture around the Salem grape. It had been bred by Edward Staniford Rogers of Salem, Massachusetts, and the colony would purchase planting rights and cuttings. This vine was a hybrid, one of about 45 that Rogers developed in his lifetime. He came about in the golden age of hybrid grapes in the Northeast, starting his hybridizing work in 1851. It was only a few years earlier, in 1845, that we see the first documented crossing of the, quote, foreign grapes and our natives, unquote. That work was done by Dr. Valk of Long Island with Black Hamburg fertilized with Isabella, which he debuted at the 1852 American Pomological Society meeting in Philadelphia with the name Ada. His was the first documented, but it's likely prominent nurseryman John Fiske Allen and his hybrid, a cross between Isabella and Chasselas de Fontainebleau, preceded Valk by a few months. Let's have to hone in on exact dates for this, and it could be that their first producing year was the same. William Prince, whose well-known Linnaean Botanic Garden and Nursery listed Zinfandel for sale in the 1830s, had also published methods for hybridizing grapes. Quote, in all attempts at artificial fecundation, I would recommend that one of the varieties selected be of native origin, as there exists no want of hybrids between European varieties alone. A large proportion of those now in cultivation have been doubtless produced by natural admixture of the pollen in the vineyards where they originated, unquote. This is just to say that the colony had many choices available to them to base the winery around. Although seemingly a fine choice, it's entirely possible they chose to go with Salem because of its name. The community's wines were always viewed as medicinal as opposed to intoxicating, and Harris seemed to sense extra power in this newfound Salem wine. The Salem vine was a cross between the wild Vitis labrusca grape, Carter, aka Mammoth Globe, and the Vitis vinifera Black Hamburg. About 35 of Rogers' hybrids were released with this parentage. Each was from a different seed of the resulting grape. Confusingly, Salem was named number 23 and later number 53. It and a couple others were given new numbers due to confusion during the distribution of vines. Rogers' Agawam grape bore a great resemblance to Salem and was probably even wider planted, though most preferred the Salem. And it was his first to be given a name to eliminate this confusion. Agawam and Wilder, Rogers number 15 and 4 respectively, were often compared to Salem. In their 1860 catalog, Prince's lists more than a dozen of Rogers' hybrids for sale, but not the Salem, under its name or either number. Other sellers described it as, quote, bunch rather large, broad, berry inclined to oval, skin thin, black, flesh tender, sweet, and delicate, vine vigorous and productive, as early as the Concord, unquote. George Hussman, in his American Grape Growing and Winemaking, would describe it as, quote, Salem, bunch full medium, compact, shouldered, berry large, round, of a peculiar brownish color with lilac bloom, juicy and sweet, with a peculiar pleasant aroma, considered by Mr. Rogers to be the best of his hybrids, but is not so generally successful here as Goethe, Lindley, Massenois, and Wilder. It is very apt to overbear and should be thinned severely. Ripens about the same as Catawba, unquote. By here, he means his location in Missouri for what it's worth. Others would describe it as large berries on a medium-sized cluster with attached skin and a light muscat labrusca-type nose and a, quote, splendid keeper, a good shipper, and of best quality for both table and wine, unquote. Sources say it was among Rogers' favorite of his crosses and closest to the ideal grape he had been aiming for. Faults were said to be its low resistance to mildew, less production than many of the other crosses, and its vigorous early growth. From my research, it seems to be rarely grown commercially still, but other Rogers hybrids have gone on to be ancestors of hybrids from the University of Minnesota and TV Munson programs. Even as a relatively new grape, the New York and northeastern vine-growing areas were littered with grapes derived from the Salem seeds. The Vesta, the Themis, Moltke, Pulpless, Michigan, Metis, Honey, Elaine, Clarissa, and more. Some crosses of those too. Many of these grapes were from one breeder, C. Engel of Paw Paw, Michigan. 100 acres of vineyards were planted at the colony. Their luck with the Salem grape was mixed, and other varieties would supplement it. Probably Delaware, Catawba, and Isabella, which were all common in the area at the time. They also purchased grapes from nearby growers. Harris's Vinecliff house on the estate would have its own experimental vineyard. After constructing a 2-story winery, yearly production was between 15 and 23,000 gallons of wine with the viticultural help of Hyde. The main cellar was 20 by 110 feet in length, constructed of stone and arched, beehive style. It was capable of holding 65,000 gallons of wine. Aside from selling these pure, native wines directly to consumers, he also operated a hotel and restaurant. According to Harris, the Brotherhood's wines were, quote, infused with the divine aura potentialized in the joy spirit and the finer electo-vinous spirit of the collective body of the grape, unquote. Because of this, the wines, it was said, had no intoxicating qualities. It was the Lily Queen, who lived in the celestial sphere, had Harris's children there, and visited him with teachings and poetry that imbued the wines with these qualities. This area of New York was becoming a stronghold of the early women's Christian temperance movement, or WCTU. And even the fact the Brotherhood had grapes planted was cause for alarm. WCTU was strongly advocating for the Concord grape to replace all other plantings because of its ability to be eaten fresh. This colony, too, would not be long for the world. Questions and clashes arose. Even in these early and formative years of his colonies, Harris would have to explain things away, like when the first death of a member happened. Oliphant and Harris also had a falling out, in which Oliphant demanded his money, causing severe financial stress for the colony. The hotel fell into disrepair. The restaurant caught fire. Wines were sold off and new vintages weren't produced. The vineyard started to be reclaimed by nature. For what it's worth, they seem to have always had cordial relations with the nearby residents, despite mostly keeping to themselves. Oliphant, someone whose next move was always unpredictable, would spend most of the rest of his life promoting Jewish colonization of Palestine. His wife would stay a part of the Brotherhood for a couple years before rejoining him, both continuing to follow the teachings of Harris, if not the man himself. The Oliphants weren't the only people of means attracted to Harris. The poet Edwin Markham, journalist W.T. Steed, and novelist Marie Corelli were all followers, although never living at the various colonies. Markham would continue to carry on correspondence with Nagasawa in the later years. Nagasawa was the only Satsuma student who remained in the Brotherhood by now. He spoke his English with a Scottish accent as he would the rest of his life. With time, he would be Harris's lieutenant, nominally in charge when Harris was absent or busy. Nagasawa had always been treated special by Harris. It's probable that as the youngest of the Japanese students, a place Harris had a great infatuation with, that Nagasawa was seen as more malleable than most. He probably was. Remember that he was only 14 when meeting Harris for the first time and thousands of miles away from his home. A father figure could be enticing. Unlike others, Nagasawa was allowed access to Harris in his mansion. The nickname Phoenix was bestowed on him by the leader, and a new job too, as Harris's secretary. We see him around 1871 taking notes and dictation of the wisdom of the angels while Harris was in a trance. He was now fully devoted to the Brotherhood. When one of his fellow students pleaded with him to return to Japan, Nagasawa replied that Harris had said that to return would be doing the bidding of the devil. And furthermore, he was fully in with the wines too, noting in his journal that he was told, quote, "Our wine contains a quality which no other wine has. If it were drank by anyone, it will bring a person who drank it into a great visitation, and so it will gradually separate good from evil," unquote. Writings about the colony from the townsfolk would go to great lengths to note how normal the followers seemed. No strange dress or eating habits, only that their hair was worn long, which was, quote, "a characteristic of almost all social and religious communists," unquote. By 1875, Harris and his most devoted followers, the 22-year-old Nagasawa and Hyde included, would move across the country. Harris would write it was because, quote, "the writer saw himself pictured, in future time, as dwelling in the vicinage of the great forests of Sequoia near the Pacific, where mingled with the sighing winds among the evergreens might be heard the murmur of the not far distant ocean," unquote. While the Brockton newspaper would say, quote, "Harris left town in February to avoid the severity of our winters and is now located in California," unquote. It's also likely Harris had heard about the growing California wine industry. In any event, they were delivered to the Santa Rosa rail station on the San Francisco and North Pacific train. Fountaingrove would be established on 700 acres in the hills of Sonoma County, a couple miles outside of the town. Their acreage is part of the former land grant of Mark West, Rancho San Miguel, which they purchased for $50 an acre on average. The name given to the colony was due to an especially vibrant spring in the upper hills. In fact, about 200 acres were swampland when purchased and required extensive drainage and tilling. The property rose from the valley up into the summits of what they called Harris Mountain, or Vine Mountain. This would be their Eden of the West, or home center. Santa Rosa citizens were originally attracted to Harris for the large tract of land and large intricate home he was building. Any religious or utopian business wasn't readily disclosed, and the newspapers and townsfolk seemed intrigued enough by the construction being completed by this wealthy man from the east and his friends. Iron gates and a long eucalyptus-lined drive would help keep the outside world at bay. To begin, the colony's main business was dairy farming, a popular pursuit in Sonoma County. Some wheat was also planted in the former swampland. The milk and butter was sold in and around Santa Rosa by his loyal followers. Stables were built and 200 acres of orchards were planted, plus 50 acres of grazing land for the cattle, pigs, sheep, and horses. Separate living quarters were built for men, women, and Harris, called the Commandery, the Familstry, and Estavosa, respectively. The men's and women's quarters were built from redwood a couple stories high. Harris's was a sprawling Georgian mansion with indoor plumbing, ballroom, a library larger than any in California with some 10,000 books, and an art collection to rival anyone in the state. Meals would often be eaten communally, and singing, dancing, or reciting poetry, mostly Harris's, was not uncommon. Publishing was always a prominent and important part of the Brotherhood, and it was implemented as quickly as possible to print books and pamphlets of teachings by Harris, as well as his poetry, and the Fountaingrove Wine Press, perhaps the first winery newsletter. Hallmarks of Harris's teaching were hard work, or use, and celibacy, and these would continue at Fountaingrove. Everyone's use, quote, would be according to their own special genius, unquote. As Fountaingrove was founded, Harris mostly stepped back from public life, preferring to write and go into his trances, where he received his guidance for the approximately 1,000 followers he had worldwide. He even built a cottage on some new property purchased to the southeast at Hood Mountain he named Linlilla. He would have very little to do with the day-to-day running of the business, leaving it more and more up to Nagasawa, who was, quote, looked up to and respected in the highest possible degree by all the brothers and sisters yet resident there, unquote. He was still under the age of 25 and one of only a few Japanese in California. By 1880, there would only be 86. In 1879, vineyards would start to dot the landscape. Prices here hadn't yet started to drop for grapes and wine, and many others would have their own large plantings. Hyde and Nagasawa started dabbling and then concentrating on farming grapes and making wine. Hyde would be remembered by a member of the Brotherhood as, quote, a past master of the art of making and blending wines. He laid the foundations of the Brotherhood and Fountaingrove vintages, unquote. Chinese and Italian laborers did most of the physical work planting the vineyard. The yield of the first real production year of 1883 was 15,000 gallons. By now, grapes and wine were truly commonplace in Sonoma County and would be the focus of the colony going forward. At the second meeting of the State Viticultural Commission held in June, among the samples of Zin and Trousseau from George West and sparkling wine from Arpad Harasti, Harris contributed samples of white wines made from Herbamont and Elvira, two American grapes. There's no records of him growing these at any of the colonies, and we don't really know the story behind them. The praise was faint for both. Quote, the Herbamont was considered more than average good quality. The Elvira was, with the exception of one number, condemned as having an uninviting odor, which no one accustomed to wines from the vinifera grape would like. The exception was that it was thought by one member that it might be useful to blend with characterless wines, unquote. But the wines would improve. Continued expansion at Fountaingrove would bring the land holdings up to 2,000 acres, with over 400 of those in vines. Though that number was always changing, mostly expanding. Zinfandel, Mataro, Petit Pinot, Gros Mancine, Lenoir, Mondouse, Cabernet Sauvignon, or Trousseau, Gamay Teinturier, Carignan, and Malbec were all planted for red wines, and Sylvaner, White Riesling, Johannesburg Riesling, Semillon, Colombard, Palomino, Pinot Blanc, Traminer, Berger, and Gutedel made up the white grapes. I want to make a quick aside on one of these grapes, the Petit Pinot. It was described as, quote, vine very hardy, a compact and moderate grower, very productive, bunch medium, compact, berry below medium, oblong, black, juicy, sweet, makes a dark red wine of fine flavor, very soft and full, unquote. We've discussed it many times before, but one of the main goals of the university and their experiment stations was to formalize names and reconcile some of the different importations of the same vines. The Viticultural Commission had a similar aim. I think this one grape will give you an idea of what they were sometimes up against. Whenever possible, I use the name for the grapes as they're referenced in the original source. From the name of this grape, you might think it's a relative of Pinot Noir, a variety known for mutations. In the Viticultural Commission report from the year the Fountaingrove vine started producing, it was noted that the grape was found in the Pellier collection of grapes in the Evergreen area of what is now San Jose. They observed the same vine in the Delmas nursery, another pioneer vine importer in San Jose. Both the Pellier brothers and Delmas were originally from France. Delmas had supplied H.W. Crabbe of the Tokelon vineyard with some of these vines, which Crabbe called Crabbe's Black Burgundy. So there we have another Pinot-ish reference. The Pellier brothers were especially known by the university for keeping their vines in order and correct. Not that Delmas didn't. The brothers had imported Petit Pinot among other vines from the Charente just north of Bordeaux, and the descriptions of their grapes all matched the descriptions of grapes given by a count of the area, except the Petit Pinot, which was described as a white grape. It was thought that this Petit Pinot may actually be a Pinot Noir mutation from that district. Crabbe's Black Burgundy is now known as a synonym for Refosco, but there are two different grapes known as Refosco, which is really more of a family of grapes. There was the one sent to the U.S. by Count Rovesenda from Turin, Italy, and the version imported from France that is most likely Mondouse Noir. Quote, locally known as Crabbe's Black Burgundy, this variety is now generally supposed to be the Petit Pinot of Burgundy, one of the many varieties of the Pinot group. Its heavy bearing, even under short pruning, and the deep tint, heavy body, good astringency, and general high quality of its wine have recommended it for extensive culture in California, unquote. Now, all of this is to say that you can understand the frustration and work ahead of the Viticultural Commission and the university in the near future. There were some 25 acres of table grapes planted at Fountaingrove too. Emperor, Cornichon, and Black Morocco. Some of the wine grapes were planted on phylloxera-resistant rootstock. Zinfandel, Alicante Bouschet, Buckland, and Muscadel de Bordelais were all on St. George, at least for part of the field. We believe Nagasawa and Hyde were aware of the devastation of phylloxera, but it hadn't yet been seen in the more mountainous terrain like Fountaingrove. In just 3 years, production more than quadrupled to 70,000 gallons in 1886. The next year, they greatly expanded capacity, building a new 3-story cellar. The first 2 levels of basalt stone and the third of brick with an iron roof. 60,000 feet of lumber were used in the building's construction. It was 130 by 62 feet, dug mainly into the side of the hill for cooling, and would hold the 200,000 gallons produced in 1888. Like most of the wine tunnels of Sonoma and California in general, Chinese laborers did the dangerous work. From there, production hovered around 250,000 gallons each year under their Fountaingrove label. In 1894, they started making a champagne. The first vintage of 6,000 bottles would rest deep in the caves until 1896. The mountain-grown vineyards would average 2.5 tons per acre on the warm, iron-rich volcanic soils. Much was made of the heat band that Fountaingrove was located in, warm enough to allow avocados and citrus to ripen. It most likely saved their 1892 vintage when so many others experienced severe frosts. Care was taken to match the exposure, soil, and elevation to the variety planted. The Hock or Germanic-style grapes got the steepest, highest sections of the vineyard. One publication noted, quote, "The wines of the Fountaingrove Vineyard Company do probably more to advertise the adaptability of Sonoma soil to produce the perfect grape than could be accomplished by any other means," unquote. Much of the product was claret and Burgundy-style red generics, besides that Hock-style white wine. But Nagasawa attributed the estate's popularity to the, quote, "peculiar merits of Zinfandel," unquote. Fortified wines were Angelica, Port, Malaga, Tokay, Muscatel, and Sherry, which had its own special bodega where it could mature, away from the other wines. It was, quote, "a wine to warm the heart of the world," unquote. That cellar held about 30,000 gallons on the top level and 60,000 on the lower floor. The sherry would be cooked there for 3 months. The other fortified wines made up around 1/5 of their total production most years. Their Cabernets would take second at the 1894 San Francisco Midwinter Fair. The white wines, many made in a, quote, "German style," like the Traminer and Chasselas, were winning awards at the state fairs. And Nagasawa's favorite to pour for guests was the Flower of Fountaingrove, Sauterne-type wine. When speaking of the generic Sauterne wines of the period, usually Sauterne will mean dry, while Haute Sauterne will mean a sweeter wine. The winery was continually expanded to fit their needs, eventually able to hold over 500,000 gallons of wine, and always equipped with the most modern and up-to-date equipment. A 38 horsepower boiler would supply steam for the crusher, the furnace for the sherry room, and power the distillery. A 2-story annex added later would expand the winery and cellar to almost a square, 132 by 128 feet. Large format oak cooperage of around 500 gallons each were commonly used, and larger 25,000 gallon casks, quote, "which look as if they were made to endure for centuries," unquote, were used for creating blends and for larger production wines. 90 tons of grapes could be crushed daily in the high point of harvest. And something around 1,200 tons a season would make their way to 100,000 gallons of fermenters via pipes arranged to limit oxygen exposure and make it easy to fill the different fermenters. That crusher was steam-powered and high up to allow the winery to be run with gravity as much as possible. An operator would control it near the elevator where grapes flowed into it. Floating covers were used on fermenters to again limit oxygen contact. Once fermentation was finished, everything would be emptied into cars that ran along a track to one of the two presses. The winery was broken up into different sections, like the South Middle with 100,000 gallons of storage capacity and 10,000-gallon tanks, or the North Middle with another 75,000 gallons and a bottling line. 20 3,000-gallon redwood casks, 11 1,500-gallon ones, and another 14 2,000-gallon oak casks provided further aging tanks. Matching the cleanliness of the nearby Tokay cellars of Kohler and Froling, quote, "A lady's silk and satin garments would not be soiled in making a tour of the place," unquote. The vineyards were under Nagasawa's control, while Hyde focused on the cellar work at the beginning. Both were sizable undertakings. There were relatively few with larger plantings, perhaps 10 or so. It's not clear when Hyde ceded control to Nagasawa, but eventually it was all in control of the young man. The population would boom during harvest. An additional 90 white men would be employed, working most hours of the day. Additional nearby families would join in by picking grapes. They were probably reinforced by those on the more distant preempted lands, and Indian families and Chinese laborers. We heard a great description of how a Sonoma harvest went in 1900 by Henry Lackman in episode 63. You should check it out. Historically, most of the helpers at Fountaingrove were of Italian descent. They would work in the vineyards, winery, and cellar. At the lunchtime meals during harvest, Nagasawa would hold court at the head of a long table, joining the men in toasts, receiving most of them and giving some himself in broken Italian with that Scottish accent. Everyone gathered around eating chicken, pasta, ravioli, and cheering. Chinese immigrants were used as well throughout the year, mostly for the more menial work. Tunnels, fertilizing vineyards, pulling out scrub brush and trees and poison oak like they were in much of Sonoma County. Despite being around 10% of the population, they were closer to 80% of the vineyard labor in the county. Japanese sightseers would occasionally help in the winery when they visited, too. Writers noted, quote, "The wines of Fountaingrove enjoy an enviable reputation, not only throughout California and the United States, but in Europe as well," unquote. The pureness of wines was guaranteed by the Fountaingrove label, and throughout 1894 and 1895, they were shipping wines to the East Coast and Europe nearly every week. 10 carloads went to Europe in 1 week in the fall of 1894. If you remember from the California Wine Association episodes, this was when prices were at one of their low points, driven down by the large merchants in San Francisco. Alongside the Fountaingrove wines were the products of De Turk, Corbel, Crab, Italian Swiss Colony, and others. Quote, "But prices went down, 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 and these people saw the San Francisco shippers engaged in a death struggle. In sheer self-defense, they had to ship their own wines. Those who could do so and commanded the capital or credit were virtually forced into the Eastern market," unquote. Like many other producers, they did see an instant bump in 1895 for wines. Nagasawa wrote, quote, "There's an increase in demand for wines, which is largely due to the revival of businesses along these lines," unquote. The Pall Mall Gazette would wish they were at Fountaingrove, enjoying California mountain Zinfandels in their original setting. Quote, "We cannot all, unfortunately, breathe the glowing mountain and sea air and bask in the splendid sunshine of the Pacific Slope in California where the Fountaingrove vineyards are situated. But when we drink the Zinfandel, we may be said to be imbibing the best essences of that glorious, invigorating air and sunshine," unquote. In what was an unusual twist, the winery and label were owned by the corporation of Lay, Clark & Co., based in Santa Rosa and New York. They had offices in Liverpool, London, Glasgow, and throughout Great Britain as well, and were said to be the first California wines introduced there. Time on the water was about 27 days to Glasgow going around the Horn. Occasionally, they would be shipped to New York and then on to Glasgow. Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe outfits sold the wines in Japan. This direct distribution model was to keep prices lower for consumers. Much of the wine was also sold to the eastern markets, especially New York, where they had their main offices at 58 Vesey Street. The World Trade Center would be built here later. Harris had a strong ownership stake, and Nagasawa was a partner in this firm, as well as Mr. Clark and Mr. Hart. We'll hear about them later. Their 58 Vesey Street address, aside from distribution offices, had a prototype wine bar or cafe. Quote, "It is the nearest approach that has yet been made in this city to the famous bodegas of Italy and Spain and to the better class of cafes of Paris," unquote. Harris would contribute his unique notes on the wines. This one might have been a Zinfandel, or perhaps the table wine, or claret. It's hard to tell. Quote, "As the great coming moves towards the surface, it takes with it the arch quality of the divine wine, making this vintage produced in consecration to the Father-Mother a vehicle of the quickening influence. Yet if this were known, the wicked would take advantage of it to prevent its passing into consumption, and therefore we must be as silent as the grave," unquote. 20,000 gallons of brandy would be distilled each year also on their Pacific Copper Works stills, the same manufacturer used by the Fresno giants Eggers and Eisen Wineries, the Pacific Wine Company, and others. The continuous still could take 2,000 gallons of wine a day powered by that steam pump. This was generally under the direct supervision of Nagasawa. It was a dangerous business, and a lot could go wrong here. Rumors always swirled around what that utopian colony of Harris's was up to. It had happened at all the previous colonies, too. The San Francisco Chronicle had sent a reporter to Fountaingrove posing as an acolyte and fan. His short investigation found nothing except some vaguely worded whispers. But more followed. Alizaire Chevalier was a muckraker journalist, suffragist, and moral reformer. Much of her life had been devoted to helping people, from women to children to prisoners and others. She had a background as a Christian Scientist, but eventually turned away from it due to the secrecy. In 1890, she requested to stay at Fountaingrove after reading many of Harris's books, staying there with her mother for about 4 months, all told. Harris is said to have given her a copy of the Chronicle article and the recently published book about Oliphant, written by Oliphant's cousin. Neither were flattering to Harris or the Brotherhood. While at Fountaingrove, and shortly after leaving, she praised Harris and the colony in writings and interviews. Within a couple months, her story had started to change. She complained of, quote, "queer convulsions and shouting," unquote, from Harris while he was in a trance, and that the wife of Fountaingrove and Harris's long-term partner Jane Lee Waring smoked Harris's pipes after him, and even allowed him to put his feet in her lap. A visit from a Swedenborgian minister gave her the boost she needed to go to the Chronicle herself. The Santa Rosa papers had generally been kind to Harris, but the San Francisco papers were another matter. This time the accusations caught on: communal bathing, sexual assault, forced abortions, and financial issues were some of them. She even went to the Japanese consul in San Francisco, telling them that Nagasawa and Ari, who operated the printing press, wanted to leave the colony. By the time Nagasawa learned her true intentions a few days before the article was published, it was too late. The letter writing, article writing, and speaking engagements were about to get started. Her story became a worldwide one, covered in papers of most of the large cities, at least in part because of the countries represented by the followers. You had Scottish, English, Japanese, and American citizens of Fountaingrove. Chevalier's campaign seemed to work. Harris married Waring soon after as, quote, "a matter of form and a concession to the prejudice of California society," unquote. Harris considered himself a full Californian now, quote, "by long relations and cherished friendships," unquote. It seemed most of Santa Rosa's residents supported Harris in the battle, or at least were on his side. Many signed their names in support of him in the Santa Rosa papers. Some wrote letters of support. It's interesting to see how differently the San Francisco papers and the Santa Rosa papers seem to cover Harris, Nagasawa, and the colony as a whole. The local papers cover the subjects like a neighbor, the San Francisco papers with a form of disgust and curiosity. Harris would withdraw further. Perhaps escaping allegations, he fled to England, intending to stay there but eventually ending up in New York. Harris would later reemerge into the world. He had a new pamphlet he had been working on, detailing the ideas of the Brotherhood, but also answering critics of his and that he manipulated others, used their wealth to enrich himself, and allegations of polygamy as well. On an early June evening of 1892, smoke drifted over Santa Rosa. Men rushed to the source on bikes, horses, or in cars. The city strictly enforced a rule that the fire truck couldn't leave the city limits, and it wouldn't have done any good here anyways. The Fountaingrove winery and distillery were engulfed in flames. By the time the groups arrived, the roof and inner support structure had collapsed, making a furnace out of the basalt and brick walls. Sparks shot out of the top, and each new cask bursting would create a roar of fire. Blue flames were made as each brandy barrel burst. More wine and brandy poured out of the doors and windows, creating a lagoon in front of the main building. Rivers of ignited brandy flowed down the hill, burning bright as they carved their path. Men stumbled around in the hot, wine-soaked ground up to their knees as they attempted to erect ladders. Some wine flowed back out into the vineyard on the other side of the building, returning to the ground where it was grown. The fire grenades the men threw in were too little, too late, and did nothing. The buckets of wine thrown on top of the flames weren't any help either. The fire had started in the tower, which is a strange place for a fire to start. Maybe a discarded cigarette or cigar butt. Who knows? There were fire hydrants, but nobody knows why no water was available from them. This led some to assume it was arson. A last-ditch attempt was made to save 24 carloads of wine in the North Annex that were waiting to be shipped. The fire had beaten the men there, though, and smoke billowed out as they broke through the wall. Some of the casks were still standing even while charred and burnt, the metal hoops glowing white-hot against the coal-black wood. Insurance would cover some of it. Building was estimated at nearly $30,000. The cooperage another $45,000, and wine would make up the rest of the estimated $200,000 loss. Over 400,000 gallons of wine were gone. Foreshadowing some of the losses in the 1906 earthquake, most of the wine lost here were the well-aged 4 to 10-year-old wines that were all but irreplaceable. Fountaingrove would pay some of the highest prices per ton for purchased grapes that year after suffering these losses, up to $30 per ton in an attempt to build up their reserves again. Harris returned from his luxury New York townhouse for a time to assess the damage before going back to New York and then Glasgow. The winery was rebuilt within 6 months. Others took interest in what Nagasawa and Fountaingrove were up to in an agricultural sense. Luther Burbank, the famed horticulturist of Santa Rosa, was friends with Nagasawa. The two men arrived in town around the same time. They would exchange information on farming practices, often riding around in Nagasawa's buggy or later his Buick together, assessing vineyards. Burbank provided some guidance on the Fountaingrove vineyards and those of Rossi and Sabarbaro of the Italian Swiss colony and Jacob Schramm of Calistoga. These trips had an acknowledged effect on Nagasawa, who felt he learned more by taking a ride up the valley than going abroad. Burbank's work with wine grapes, though, would only go so far. He was an honorary member of the Sonoma branch of the WCTU, and once remarked on a new vine grown from seed, quote, "This is not a wine grape. The continued use of wine destroys the finer qualities of both body and mind. Tell the children I have never produced a superior wine grape, and that if I do ever produce one, it shall be at once destroyed. No wine grape will ever be sent into the world from my plant school." Unquote. California wine exports to Japan would actually dip for a time as the Fountaingrove vineyards thrived. Nagasaki and Kagoshima, Nagasawa's old home, were now producing wines. Wine in Kagoshima goes back even earlier than our story. Francis Xavier, later St. Francis Xavier, the first Jesuit missionary and a founder of the order, first visited Japan in August of 1549. Due to the perceived danger of sailing into these unknown waters, Xavier and his group had to hire pirates to take them ashore. He met and shared wine with the daimyo of the Satsuma province, Takehisa Shimazu, who became the first to taste wine in Japan. The University of California and their experiment stations were in the midst of expansions, experimentation, and education. Fountaingrove would play its own part in that, conducting yeast trials for the 1895 harvest. They were among a small group of wineries comparing different cultured yeasts with native yeast fermentations. The Italian Swiss colony and Almaden vineyards experimented with the Burgundian yeast along with Fountaingrove, while Beringer Brothers and others experimented with Johannesburg yeast or Algerian yeast. 2 flasks of Burgundy yeast were sent to Santa Rosa in October to ferment some Mataro. The fermented wine was barreled down and brought out in May of 1896 for testing and analysis. They found the wine with the cultured yeast to be, quote, smoother, fuller, but less developed and with less bouquet than the witness. The acidity of the treated wine was smoother and more agreeable. Both wines were examined microscopically and were found to be normal, unquote. The results were consistent with all the Burgundian yeast experiments. Quote, the effect seems generally to be to make the wine rounder and smoother, but of slower development. The Burgundy yeast, like the Johannesburg, seems inferior to the native California yeast in eliminating sugar from heavy musts, unquote. Nagasawa sent for his nephew Tomoki Ijichi from Japan in 1896 to join him at Fountaingrove. He would assist with winemaking and even owned a copy of Emmett Rixford's The Wine Press and the Cellar, a book winemakers and cellar people still reference today. Perhaps he assisted in some of the award-winning wines they produced at the time. He seems to have had a hand in the distilling operation at the very least. Other nephews would join in 1902 and 1916. The winery was a constant draw and source of employment for Japanese men living in California. Saikichi Yanagisiwa worked at Fountaingrove for a time. He had previously been a member of the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony. The colony had been established in the Gold Hill area of El Dorado County in 1869, but was short-lived, the members scattering throughout the state or back to Japan. Another member, Matsugoro Ohoto, would stay in California a few more years after the colony disbanded. He most likely stayed at Fountaingrove with Yanagisiwa for at least 2 years before returning to Japan. In 1877, he would start making wine in Yamanishi, becoming Japan's first true winemaker and teacher, helping to craft the sweet Amakuchi wine, most likely with the teachings of Nagasawa guiding him. The knowledge exchange was mutual, and Nagasawa would try his hand at silk when he and Tomiko brought mulberry bushes and silkworms back from Japan on Nagasawa's first trip back to his homeland. He would ship his silk back to Japan, where it was turned into garments he forever treasured. Yamanishi still remains the main region for wine growing. It wasn't always peaceful or easy at Fountaingrove. One of the stranger and sadder moments happened in 1896 when Harris's 15-year-old granddaughter Mary committed suicide with strychnine. Her and her sister still lived at Fountaingrove, the only members of their family to do so. They stayed mostly with the Clark family, who lived in the former Familisteri by now. According to Nagasawa, quote, the marriage relations among us are the same as among other people, unquote. Meaning couples lived together and celibacy was no longer required. This is the Clark as in Lay, Clark & Co., who we just heard about earlier. After leaving the colony and moving to New York, Clark was sent back to Fountaingrove due to his befriending folks Harris didn't approve of. Mary Harris, the 15-year-old, would often have psychotic episodes or temporary insanity, as Nagasawa noted when he was questioned. She had jumped out of a 20-foot-high window a year before. At times, the other members would go so far as to lock her in a room until the episode passed. That's what happened this time. According to Nagasawa, quote, she said she had taken strychnine and that she had only taken a little in order to scare us. I don't know why she tried to scare us," unquote. He apparently tried counteracting the poison with egg whites, mustard, warm water, and sweet oil, but in the end, her only comfort was Nagasawa holding her hand as she passed away. He tried and succeeded in getting the Santa Rosa papers to downplay it at first, but the San Francisco ones caught on. Accusations came rushing back, and new ones were added. Maybe she killed herself because she was forced into an arranged marriage. Why was she locked in the room? Where did the strychnine come from? Where was her sister? Was it the loneliness of living on the ranch? Who knows what happened in that, quote, house of mystery. In the end, there was an inquest. The community physician, Nagasawa, the coroner, and others testified. Sitting on the jury panel was Clark, who, along with his wife, was the girl's guardian. This wasn't against any laws or even all that unusual, I guess. Always leading to this unwanted attention was the secrecy of the community, or as Nagasawa put it, quote, "We wish to do everything in a simple way," unquote. Less than 24 hours after the funeral, the boarding house kitchen caught fire, burning the building to the ground. The circumstances of living and working in a rural area around flames and machinery were never far in those days. In 1897, 2 workers were attacked by 3 men on the Healdsburg Road leading towards the winery from Santa Rosa. A tea merchant was driving by in his buggy and scared the robbers off, delivering the men to the hospital where they recovered. In 1892, Nagasawa was confined to his house for weeks after sustaining injuries from the kick of a horse. Throughout our stories of pre-Prohibition winemaking, we've seen disasters from winery explosions and fires and more mechanical means like Arthur Lackman having his leg horribly broken by a crusher. Fountaingrove is no different. In 1896, a young Japanese worker, Sakichi Yoshinito, was killed instantly when he was caught in the rotating belt of the wine press, crushing his skull. In 1899, the famous Round Barn was constructed. It became a landmark in the area for over 100 years. During Nagasawa's time, it was used as a horse barn. It could hold up to 60. He was always a fan of horses and had thoroughbreds, carriage horses, Percheron, and Arabians that he bred. Technically, the barn is 16-sided, 70 feet in diameter and 60 feet high, but it's the Round Barn. It's sometimes referred to as the Russian barn, but Russians had left the area long before it was constructed. There were other utopian colonies that built round barns as well. The circle barn shape may in part be inspired by utopian colonies relying on the circle for symbolism during this time. In 1900, Harris decided to give up control of Fountaingrove as well as his possessions. The estate was sold to 5 loyal members of the Brotherhood. Nagasawa, of course, among them. In a unique inheritance structure, when one of the 5 died, their share was divided among the still living. Thus, as each passed away, Nagasawa was eventually left as the sole owner of Fountaingrove. Harris passed away in 1906. He'd always told his followers that it would never happen and his body would be renewed continually. But it did happen, on March 23rd. Jane Waring, or Dovey, Harris's wife, and Edwin Markham, one of his most famous followers, were with him as he seemingly went into a trance. It wasn't until the 29th, when the body started to decompose, that they realized or accepted the worst had happened. After cremating Harris quietly, Nagasawa was forced to hurry back home after the earthquake struck on April 18th. Aside from San Francisco, Santa Rosa was hit harder than anywhere. There's no record of damage to Fountaingrove from the 1906 earthquake, but combined versions of the Santa Rosa Republican and Democrat newspapers were printed on Fountaingrove's old presses. The same presses that put out so much of Harris's writings and poetry. Nagasawa's following of Harris's teachings continued. It was something he seemed to take seriously and truly believe even after the leader passed away. Nagasawa never married. Nearly his entire life, he was told that he couldn't have romantic interests, from the samurai training and then with Harris and his celibacy. The use became a mostly commercial enterprise, with Harris's teaching being followed by Nagasawa, if not actively promoted, and it gradually drifted towards a secular enterprise. The mood lightened with Nagasawa in control, while his reputation, respect, and influence continued to grow. The quote, melancholy and ghostly atmosphere started to dissipate. Celebrities and town members would appear at his luncheons. Despite these changes, current and former members marveled at how strictly Harris's orders to Nagasawa to keep Fountaingrove exactly the same had been followed. Except the wine business was now called the Fountaingrove Vineyard Company. Phylloxera finally struck at Fountaingrove in 1903. It hit this area later than many others in Sonoma County. In Isaac de Turck's 1893 report on Sonoma vineyards, many noted the ravages of phylloxera, especially around the town of Sonoma. The growers around Santa Rosa didn't seem to notice any infestation. Some, Nagasawa included, had already started experimenting with hopefully resistant rootstocks. Fountaingrove, for their part, notes, quote, Lay Clark & Co., Fountaingrove, Santa Rosa. Total, 400 acres. In wine grapes, 375. In table grapes, 25 acres. Soil, red, ashy, sandy loam, and hill adobe. Upland exposure, all directions. Crop, 1,500 tons. Wine on hand, 250,000 gallons. Cooperage, oak, 300,000 gallons, unquote. Unfortunately, some of the vineyard had been first planted before phylloxera was widely understood and before it was found that certain American rootstocks provided resistance to it. Like we heard earlier, they had been experimenting with rootstock for years. Quote, Zinfandel on St. George, 5 years old, on light, ashy soil, becoming very hard in summer, are very vigorous and yield very well. Alicante Boucher, Becklin, and Muscatel de Bordelais on the same stock are doing well, though too young to bear yet. Unquote. This progressive planting on resistant stock surely helped them recover quicker than most. Nagasawa was quoted alongside fellow winemen like George de la Tour, Paul Masson, John Wheeler, and others. Their experiences with yield, vigor, quality, and graft success varying considerably on the experimental rootstocks. New vines were planted on rootstock provided by the university from the experiment stations, helped along by Professor Bialetti. Nagasawa had always been good friends with the man and would often visit the Davis experiment station to talk shop and get the newest advice. In 1905, Fountaingrove was planting, quote, considerable acreage of new vineyards. There would be about 75 acres of, quote, different varieties of wine grapes. Pinot Noir, Pinot Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chenin Blanc, Chardonnay, Claret Blanche, Grand Noir, Liston, Lemberger, Johannesburg Riesling, Sylvaner, White Riesling, and Malbec and others were planted. Some other vines directly from Europe may have been imported through Mr. Freeman and their New York office. In the meantime, grapes were purchased, but 400 acres were producing again by 1911. They'd been purchasing a few hundred tons a year even before phylloxera hit. During the fight against phylloxera and the replanting, entertaining was again a common sight at Fountaingrove. Incoming and outgoing consulate members, visiting Japanese dignitaries, and a general who's who of the area were invited for meals. Nagasawa seemed to really hit his stride as the leader of Fountaingrove. But other troubles would continue to pop up over time. All of Fountaingrove was nearly lost in 1908 when a lamp in the commandery exploded, its glass hitting the employee that lived there. Within minutes, fire engulfed the building, spreading fast through the old redwood structure. But luckily the night was still, and a large group of townsfolk from Santa Rosa once again quickly headed over in cars, on bikes, or horses, some to help, some to watch. Nagasawa seemed to take it all in stride, happy that nobody was seriously hurt and that the fire didn't spread. The building was at least partially insured. In late 1909, Nagasawa was attending to a still. He was still supervising the distilling firsthand. Wine had stopped flowing into it for whatever reason, and while he stood on top of the still trying to fix the issue, steam pressure built up, blowing the top off of it, which shot up, crashing against the metal roof. The steam and superheated wine surrounded Nagasawa's lower legs, giving him serious burns between the feet and knees. He was confined to his bed for a few weeks while recovering. Through Bioletti and others, the vines of Fountaingrove would outlive the winery. Bioletti was very familiar with the Fountaingrove vineyards and would often visit and take notes on how different varieties were doing. In 1911 and 1912, Bioletti was planning on taking cuttings from Fountaingrove of many of the recently planted varieties to plant at the Davis Experimental Vineyard. Cuttings of at least Malbec and probably some of the other vines were taken from Fountaingrove. These would be propagated during the second round of planting at the Department Variety Collection Vineyard No. 1. The Malbec was row 46, vines 21 through 24. Growing at Fountaingrove, the vines were described as, quote, "The plants appeared to be doing well, although the crop was light. The berries were of irregular size, blue in color, and sweet. Many of the berries were seedless. There was no graft enlargement at the union of scion and stalk," unquote. Records became fuzzy as this vineyard was moved multiple times in the 20s, 40s, and 60s with varying degrees of precision in the notebooks. In 1962, cuttings from this vineyard underwent heat treatment. To the best of anyone's ability, it's been determined that FPS Malbec No. 6 is most likely from the original Fountaingrove cuttings and the old variety collection. The other possibility is that it's derived from cuttings that were at the Tulare experiment station, the source for the other Malbec cuttings in the original Davis vineyard. We looked at that station a bit in episode 26. Ridge Vineyards too has ties to Fountaingrove. William Short replanted what is now called the Torrey Ranch area of the Montebello Vineyard with cuttings from Fountaingrove. He dug the holes by hand, field grafted the cuttings onto St. George rootstock, and watered the vines by hand from a well 100 yards away. These vines were some of the first the new owners of Ridge used to make wine and would have been present in the 1971 Judgment of Paris Montebello, amongst other legendary wines, even up to the current day. Paul Draper would give credit to these old vines. Quote, "The partners at Ridge had the chance, so rare in the New World, to see what quality mature vines would make before they decided to reopen the winery. I think it was crucial to their financial success that they were able to base the quality of the wine on the quality of the vineyard, not on the sophistication of the winemaking." Unquote. In 2007, Ridge contributed cuttings of 4 of the most healthy of these vines to Foundation Plant Services, or FPS, in order that they could undergo disease testing and cleanup if required, and made available for others. Cabernet clones 62, 70, 71, and 65.1 are now in the FPS program. At the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, which was made to show off a rebuilt San Francisco to the world, as well as celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal, over 300 wines were judged. We heard about some of this in Part 7 of the CWA series. The chairman was Charles Carpy. Alongside him, representing California, were Frederick Bioletti of the university, Henry Lackman of the CWA, and Kanaye Nagasawa, doing double duty as a representative of Japan and Sonoma. He would have been present as the delegates from different countries argued about how California wines should be named. This time it was especially heated over port wines, or port-type wines as the Portuguese representative would refer to the generic California versions. He and the other judges would consider the brightness, bouquet, color, body, taste, purity, alcohol level, and harmony of the wines before deciding which would receive medals. 13 varieties of grapes were sent from Fountaingrove to be displayed at the exhibition in October. For many, this was the high water mark of California wine pre-Prohibition. It never got much better. It must have been a great time for Nagasawa as well. A couple years later, Hollywood would call, and scenes of the vineyards and harvesting and winemaking would be filmed at Fountaingrove. Nagasawa's respect continued to grow in the Santa Rosa and the wine communities, but anti-Japanese sentiments had been growing larger by the year. Even the Pacific Wine and Spirits Review that faithfully covered the California wine industry, Nagasawa included, would run articles denouncing the Japanese presence in the wine industry. One article stated that many were happy to have Japanese men as paid labor, though they would have preferred white men, and they looked forward to the opening of the Panama Canal when it would be easier for white laborers to arrive in California during the harvest season. The Japanese labor force was controlled in a similar manner to the Chinese laborers in the Fresno area we heard about in episode 63. They worked for a boss or foreman, and when picking were paid by the box, lived communally, and moved as needed for the different crops. One of the primary complaints was that the Japanese laborers would generally save their money to purchase land. By 1912, Japanese immigrants owned nearly 5,000 acres in Fresno County and nearly 1,000 each in Merced, Tulare, and Solano counties. More and more vineyards in the Central Valley were becoming Japanese-owned, and some white growers felt threatened. Quote, "While no vineyardist in California is particularly anxious to have a Japanese as his neighbor, either as a leasee or an owner, he is mighty glad to have him handy at the vintage, for white labor is usually very scarce. Last fall it was difficult even to get Japanese, and as a result, they were practically in a position to dictate their own terms." Unquote. Working for the highest bidder was common. Once when they found the Italian Swiss colony's Madeira outfit was paying less than nearby growers, they walked off the job in the middle of the harvest. After this, the colony would hold back 25% of each day's pay until harvest was completed. One bright spot as far as they were concerned, though, is that the Japanese seemed to have an interest in wine and no religious objections to it. More wine was being shipped to Japan every month after that dip we talked about earlier. Wine was appearing on dinner tables and at events. Quote, "Prominent Californians who have visited Japan say that the wealthy class there are past masters at entertaining, and that at every dinner wine flows like water, champagne being common. But there is a very limited variety of wines offered. They serve sherry, sauterne, red Bordeaux, and champagne in that order named. This program is hardly ever departed from. Of course, the hotels carry fine clarets, Mosels, Hocks, etc." Unquote. Parties from Japan would also become acquainted with and enjoy California native wines. On a tour of the U.S. connected with the Alaska Yukon Exposition in Seattle, California merchants made sure the group was supplied with cases and cases of wine for dinners on the cross-country tour. Beer in Japan was another matter, and most of the breweries were Japanese-controlled and the foreign ones driven out. They even made enough to start exporting. As Prohibition took over, Fountaingrove closed its New York office on the order of Nagasawa. Like others, the winery had cleared out much of its stock, but still had thousands of gallons of wine left. They'd been selling wine up until the last 30 minutes as instructed by the law. Once they could no longer make wine, some of their grapes went to home winemakers across the valley and the east, too. At least partly due to their distribution network and experience in the East Coast markets, Fountaingrove was able to successfully ship grapes to Chicago and New York despite the red tape and small print contracts from the government, railroads, and grape brokers. Cooking sherry was the only wine they continued to sell. It was salted so heavily that nobody would think of drinking it straight. A medicinal tonic was also offered, which was made from sherry and beef broth and contained 22% alcohol. It wasn't the only one with a recipe along these lines. Grape juice, too, which was praised by professors at the university as, quote, "the best grape juice they tasted in the United States," unquote. Unlike many, Fountaingrove never grafted over vines to the better shipping grapes like Alicante Bouschet. Though they had some planted, they continued on with the same high-quality winemaking grapes that were in the ground pre-Prohibition. In the early 20s, Robert Hart, former Brotherhood member, and his wife tried to gain control of Fountaingrove. Hart arrived at Fountaingrove, suitcase in hand, one morning. He had decided against sending a letter to Nagasawa and instead chose to arrive when he knew Nagasawa would be leaving for Japan a few days later. Due to his intentionally poor timing, the meetings would be brief. Nagasawa also didn't seem too interested in what Hart had to say and was determined to, quote, paddle his own canoe. Nagasawa took his trip as planned and was able to escape injury in the Tokyo earthquake that struck while he was there. Arriving back at his home in California, he was determined to put an end to Hart's actions. writing that Hart had disrespected their father and hinted that he knew Hart had likely embezzled money from the New York Fountaingrove office. This seemed to keep Hart at bay. Even as Fountaingrove struggled on in Prohibition, Nagasawa's star continued to rise. In 1924, he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, the first national award in Japan, mostly on the strength of his support for Japanese immigrants. He would continue to receive more awards from the government as time went on. In 1926, Nagasawa was 70 years old, making his way through Prohibition. His age, quote, had not rendered him weak in any sense of the word, unquote. And this is wild, literally, but he was attacked by a deer, a buck, while at Fountaingrove. He wrestled the animal to the ground by its lower antlers for 20 minutes, holding it there until help arrived. He got some lacerations on his head and knees, and the deer got lassoed and penned up. Though a mild-mannered man, a reporter witnessed glimpses of Nagasawa's childhood samurai training when showing the reporter his sword, drawing it out in a quick, smooth, practiced motion like he had done it 1,000,000 times. In 1931, he withstood further attacks of the Hart family to take over Fountaingrove. Years before, the Harts, who were 2 of the 5 Harris ceded control to, gave up their claim to Fountaingrove in order to chase $100,000 in cash from the Harris estate. Now they were back and wanting Fountaingrove. Despite contracts being signed and Nagasawa having everything in order, a wealthy white couple versus an older Japanese man from a utopian colony made the case intriguing, and it wouldn't necessarily be an easy win for Nagasawa with the amount of anti-Asian sentiment at the time. The judge ruled for Nagasawa, adding, quote, "The question of Nagasawa's Japanese citizenship never entered the case," unquote. The judge had also determined that Hart had bragged to friends of the deal he got over Nagasawa a few years back. This year was an eventful one for Nagasawa, as he was also brought up on charges related to the manufacturing of his Prohibition-era Fountaingrove wine tonic. It was alleged the tonic had less solids than were permitted under law. He seems to have escaped any serious charges by testifying that the samples analyzed were taken from the top of the barrel, arguing that the lees had settled to the bottom and that if stirred up, the proper amount of solids would be present in a new sample. As Prohibition came to an end, the New York office reopened and Fountaingrove wines again shipped east. The vineyards were still in fine condition and planted with excellent varieties, and the wines they had on hand were well taken care of. Nagasawa would continue to run Fountaingrove until 1934, persevering through Prohibition and ownership challenges from former members. It sounds like he threw some pretty wild parties where the wines were plentiful during Prohibition. The cigars also. He was almost never seen without an expensive cigar in his mouth. His hospitality was legendary with the well-known men of the area. Celebrities, poets, and judges were entertained at Fountaingrove. Japanese government officials, too. Accounts say he didn't sell any bottles of wine, and they remember more and more bottles stacking up in the cellars. He even entertained school children on field trips, showing off his 500-year-old swords and book collections before serving them strawberries, cake, and ice cream. Or you could find him giving talks with women's groups about his life. He presided over Fountaingrove at an important time for the Japanese community, which grew greatly from perhaps just him and a couple others at the start of Fountaingrove, and then 1,000 by 1890, and over 40,000 in 1910. Nagasawa worked with the consul in San Francisco to allow even more. Many were farmers. Some of his Japanese friends were amazingly successful, like the potato king George Shima, who was the largest potato producer in the country, working out of his 28,000 acres in the Sacramento Delta. He was also the first Japanese-American millionaire. Or Kiyoshi Hirasaki and his 1,200-acre Gilroy farm based around garlic. And closer to home, the Matsuda family that settled in Sebastopol. Theirs was a classic immigrant story, working as hired hands, saving up, and finally going off on their own in the apple drying business. Others settled on their own land or other farms in the San Joaquin Valley. By about 1920, they owned 1/8 of the state's farmland. Nagasawa would make 4 trips back to Kagoshima during his time in California. Japan and China and Korea would treat him as royalty when he arrived. He would give speeches, meet with officials, be shown around the cities and countryside, mostly traveling by train. On one trip, he even gave gifts of ponies. Kanaye Nagasawa passed away on March 31st, 1934, was cremated the next day. He had been confined to his bed for most of the last year and had been seriously ill for another year or two. A bout with pneumonia finally did it. His ashes would make a fifth trip back to Japan. The State Railroad Commissioner, Wallace L. Ware, one of Nagasawa's best friends, made his way to Fountaingrove as soon as he heard of Nagasawa's passing, helping to organize the funeral and delivering the eulogy. California justices of the Supreme Court and judges were honorary pallbearers. Nagasawa desperately wanted his grandnephew, Kasuke, the son of Tomoki, then in high school and born in California, to take over the winery after his death. Unfortunately, California's alien land law enacted in 1913 wouldn't allow this. Loopholes in the law that would have allowed the underage Kasuke to take control had been closed in the early 20s. Nagasawa would spend a huge amount of money on lawyers in a fight to allow the land and business to be passed down. He had to start selling off parcels of land to pay his lawyer even, who was more or less run out of town. The majority of people in Santa Rosa were on Nagasawa's side in the battle. The family received only about $3,500 for his estate worth over $200,000. Ware got much of it, allowing the family remaining at the ranch only 24 hours to gather what belongings they could and leave the property. The estate was sold to Grass Valley mining magnate Errol McBoyle. McBoyle was supposedly driving past the ranch when his hat flew off. Stopping to chase it down, he found the place for sale. Believe that story if you will. He hired fine wine men and the sparkling winemaker Hans Cornell and Kurt Opper. Great wines were produced again at Fountaingrove. Semillon, Pinot Noir, Riesling, and a Zinfandel with about 10% Petit Syrah and Carignan rounding it out. That first 1937 vintage was supposedly the greatest Sonoma wine Joseph Swan had ever tasted. You can't see it on a podcast, but Fountaingrove was one word during the Nagasawa years. During this post-repeal era, it was spelled with two words. The great wine historian Ernest Pennenew managed the estate for a few years, too. The later Fountaingrove wines also contributed to Ridge in their own way. Paul Draper called a late 30s Fountaingrove Zinfandel from a large tasting in the 70s, quote, incredibly complex, rich wines of absolute first quality and had a quarter-inch at least of sediment on the bottom of the bottles, unquote. He also marveled how it wasn't faded or oxidized like some of the other wines, and also wasn't held in suspended animation like some of the more processed wines. The Fountaingrove and the Larkmead wines were, quote, unbelievably lovely, fully developed wines. The few remaining old winemakers who were soon to retire made the Larkmead and the Fountaingrove in the old traditional approaches, where pressed wine was not necessarily not included, where you had long fermentations, natural yeast fermentations, and natural malolactics. The surprise with these Zinfandels at the potluck was that several of them, and particularly my favorite, the Larkmead, and second favorite, the Fountaingrove, were wines of a complexity and a richness that we rarely, if even ever, seen in an older California wine. Even after Nagasawa's death, Japanese citizens continued to be drawn to the winery, sometimes helping out on a bottling line or on a harvest crew. By the early 1950s, 400 acres of vineyard were torn out. Development steadily moved in, turning it into a neighborhood of Santa Rosa. On October 9th, 2017, the red barn that was for many the symbol of Fountaingrove burned in the Tubbs Fire, at the time the most destructive wildfire in California history. The adjacent Paradise Ridge winery that had a small museum dedicated to Nagasawa burned too. Awards and personal items from the man went up in smoke. Everything was lost except for a training sword that was removed from the rubble. The people of Kagoshima sent $75,000 for recovery efforts. Although the average Japanese citizen might not know who Nagasawa was, his name and story are well known in the areas he lived. Nagasawa is still known as one of the Kagoshima 15 in his birthplace. There's a statue of them all at the train station. Santa Rosa and Kagoshima still have ties too. A statue of Luther Burbank stands in Kagoshima. presented by Santa Rosa. And Santa Rosa has a statue of Nagasawa given to the city by Kagoshima. At least one thesis and multiple books about the man have been published. Film crews have traveled from Japan, some of them only months ago. A wine bar in Kagoshima is named after Nagasawa. There have been multiple scholarly essays, studies, and books dissecting the community and how it was viewed from a racial, sexual, and religious perspective. At the beginning, we heard Ronald Reagan's praise for the man in joining the two countries. Quote, "In 1865, a young samurai student, Kanaye Nagasawa, left Japan to learn what made the West economically strong and technologically advanced. 10 years later, he founded a small winery at Santa Rosa, California, called the Fountaingrove Round Barn and Winery. Soon he became known as the Grape King of California. Nagasawa came to California to learn and stayed to enrich our lives. Both our countries owe much to this Japanese warrior turned businessman." Thanks for listening today. This episode, more than any other I've worked on, has an ever-evolving group of people keeping the story alive. It's one that's captivated many people. Not just Nagasawa's story, but others are just as invested in the lives of Thomas Lake Harris, Edward Markham, Lawrence Oliphant, Thomas Glover, or the Brotherhood of the New Life story. Every person I spoke with had another person in mind for me to speak with. Gayla Barron, Eiji Akaboshi, Steve Amond, and Professor Takuhara Mori were all kind enough to give me some of their time. Maureic Bick and Fern Harger are two more that have kept the story alive through their writings and actions. The Wonder Seekers of Fountaingrove, Gay's book, is well worth tracking down if you want to know more details on the Brotherhood and the utopian colony of Fountaingrove as a whole. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast helps too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.